Good afternoon here on the East Coast of the US. I'm Denise LeBlanc, Executive Director of Fuller Craft Museum. Welcome to Excavating History's Technique, Research, and Collaboration, our opening program for the exhibition Another Crossing, Artists Revisit the Mayflower Voyage. Nearly 5 years in the planning, this international exhibition examines the cultural impact of this pivotal event on American, Indigenous, and world cultures. I'd like to start today's program with a land acknowledgement. Fuller Craft Museum gratefully acknowledges the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts nations, upon whose ancestral homeland we gather. We honor and respect all Indigenous people connected to this land, originally known as Saugatucket. Located in Plymouth County, Fuller Craft recognizes the waterways, ponds, lakes, ocean, wildlife, and other natural resources that are an enduring part of this area. Indigenous communities have belonged to this land for hundreds of generations, and native populations from many nations make their home in this region today. Please join us in recognizing and honoring their ancestors, descendants, elders, and all other members of their communities. As well, I would like to acknowledge those who've contributed to this project. We offer boundless thanks to project partners, the Plymouth College of Art and the Box, Plymouth, England, for their tireless efforts and collaborative spirit in developing Another Crossing, Artists Revisit the Mayflower Voyage. Much gratitude is also due to Guest Curator Glenn Adamson for his expert leadership, brilliant curation, and steadfast camaraderie. At the heart of Another Crossing are the exhibiting artists who boldly engage with this complex and timely exhibition. Annette Bellamy, Sonya Clark, David Clarke, Michelle Erickson, Jeffrey Gibson, Mississippi, Choctaw, Cherokee, Jasleen Kaur, Christien Meindertsma, Jonathan James Perry, Akina Wampanoag, Katie Schwab, and Allison Smith. Another Crossing, Artists Revisit the Mayflower Voyage would not be possible without the funding support of the Joan Pearson Watkins Trust, Princess Yachts, Carolyn R. Grayboys Fund, Hamilton Company Charitable Foundation, Jonathan Leo Fairbanks Exhibition Fund, Plymouth City Council, and Arts Council England. Much gratitude is also due to program sponsors Plymouth Center for the Arts, Plymouth 400th, Pilgrim Hall Museum, and Plymouth Antiquarian Society. Another Crossing is also funded in part by the following cultural councils: Abington, Bridgewater, Brockton, East Bridgewater, Foxborough, Halifax, Hanson, Hingham, Holbrook, and Mansfield, Middleborough, North Attleboro, Norton, Raynham, Scituate, Taunton, and Whitman. Please do see the chat box for additional exhibition collaborators. Today's 2-hour program will be moderated by Guest Curator Glenn Adamson and feature artists including Sonya Clark, Jeffrey Gibson, Allison Smith, Christien Meindertsma, and collaborator Elizabeth James Perry. Jasleen Kaur, originally scheduled for today's program, is unable to attend. Today's moderator, Glenn Adamson, is a curator and writer who works at the intersection of craft, design history, and contemporary art. He has previously been the director of Museum of Arts and Design, head of research at the V&A, and curator at the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee. He's the co-host of Design and Dialogue, a weekly online interview series co-presented with Friedman Benda Gallery. Adamson's publications include Fewer Better Things, Art in the Making, co-authored with Julia Bryan Wilson, The Invention of Craft, Postmodernism, Style and Subversion, The Craft Reader, and Thinking Through Craft. He contributes regularly to Art in America, Crafts, Frieze, the magazine Antiques, and other publications. Adamson was the co-curator of Crafting America at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art 2021, Objects USA 2020 at the Company Gallery, Volcus, The Breakthrough Years at MAD, Beasley, Designs of the Year 2017, and at the Design Museum London, and Things of Beauty Growing, British Studio Pottery at the Yale Center for British Art. His biographical study of the artist Lenore Tawney is included in the John Michael Kohler Art Center's exhibition catalog, Mirror of the Universe. His book, Craft, An American History, was published by Bloomsbury in January of 2021. And now, please welcome friend and colleague, Glenn Adamson.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that super kind introduction. And hi, everybody. It's great to see you all here. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in as well. This is not the end of a journey, because the journey has a ways yet to go, but boy, are we deep into this journey. We've been working on this show since 2016 in various ways. Of course, it was meant to open, just to state the blindingly obvious, it was meant to actually open on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Voyage, not the 401st, but obviously events intervened. And so here we are, and now we are gathered to have a conversation about this show, which I have to say has turned out to be the most beautiful and moving project that I've had the privilege to be involved with curatorially, and that's entirely thanks to all of you as our contributing artists. So what I'm going to do is share my screen and first show you some images of the exhibition itself. And then we're going to hear from each of our contributing panelists about the specific body of work that they created for the show. So here again is the artist list. And I should say, as you'll see, several of these artists also involve collaborators in their projects, and they will be acknowledged in due course. But when we first started the project, these were the 10 folks that I reached out to and we invited to be part of the project. It's also important to acknowledge that in addition to the Fuller Craft Museum, we have important partners over in Plymouth, England, the other Plymouth, as we tend to call it in the New England area. And this is, of course, where the Mayflower set out from in 1620. And we had the amazing opportunity to be hosted by those partners, the Box, which is a new museum there in Plymouth, and also the Plymouth College of Art. And they hosted us on the first of 2 research visits. The other research visit was held, of course, and hosted by the Fuller, held in Massachusetts. So this is a group of the artists in that first research visit. And what we did was to look at historic architecture, at historical objects in collections and historic homes. And more importantly than that, I suppose, get to know one another and understand each other's vantage points on this, this event, this historical event that we were commemorating. I wouldn't say celebrating. Rather, I would say that this was a historical occurrence that had sent massive rippling shockwaves through history, through space, through time, through culture. And we wanted to gain as rich an understanding of that as we possibly could. And the research visits were absolutely essential in achieving that. And those of you who might be joining in the audience from the UK should know that the exhibition will actually open early next year at the Box. So it will be on view in Plymouth across the ocean. So interestingly, the show is traveling in the opposite direction, the one that the Mayflower took. This is the show as people now can see it in the Fuller Craft Museum. As you can see, it's a relatively spare exhibition, and sort of physical or material palette is somewhat muted. And I think one reason for that is the somewhat unusual constraint that I placed upon the artists who were participating. So really, there were only 2 instructions that I offered to the artists. One was, of course, to make it work in light of the Mayflower and its history and legacy and impact and all the implications of that event. The second instruction, if you like, was a little bit more unreasonable on my part. What I asked the artists to do was to create a work only using technology that existed already in 1620. And the reason that I wanted to do this was to create a kind of anchor in time and also a conversation between our moment and that moment 400 years ago. But also what I wanted to do was to invite the artists off on a kind of research path where they would engage with the material realities of that moment 4 centuries ago. So what I'm now going to do is just quickly sort of whip around the exhibition, just so you can have a sense of what it looks like. And then I'll briefly talk about each of the artists who are not represented on the panel. Here you're seeing in the foreground Katie Schwab's welcome mat, so-called. Above the visitor's head is Jonathan James Parry's Machoon, which is, he thinks of as a kind of rescue vessel. And I'll explain that more in a second, which is really kind of the heart of the exhibition in a lot of ways. Over there on the left, you see Allison Smith's work. And behind that, the hanging work is by David Clarke. More views of these two artists' work. On the right-hand side of that first gallery, we have Jeffrey Gibson's work, which you'll be hearing about in a moment from him directly. This is the back gallery, and against the back wall is another piece by Katie Schwab. It says, "Welcome, my friends," and that's a piece of text that she got from a piece of 17th century Delft ware. And then in the foreground, you have a sort of collaborative project that was spearheaded by Annette Bellamy, working with a group of Indigenous Alaskan artists. And behind that, you have Jesselyn Carr's work, which I'll show you more in a second. And these are ceramic vessels, which is a collaboration between Michelle Erickson and, again, Jonathan James Parry, who also made the Machoon. And here is Jonathan making the Machoon. A Machoon is a traditional seagoing vessel, waterborne vessel, that's created by felling a tree, usually with fire, and then also hollowing out the core of the volume of the wood with fire. And it's interesting to note that this is a much more efficient way of felling and hollowing timber than anything that's done with steel tools in a European tradition. So it's a really good example of how native populations develop their own technologies that are entirely analog, of course, and in very many ways superior to the technologies that were imported by settler cultures from Europe. As you can see, he then finishes the interior with tools, and there you see the Machoon hung from the ceiling in the show. He's provided it with a paddle and also with a series of medicine bundles. The concept of the work is that it's meant to serve as a kind of, as I said earlier, a rescue vessel or a salvage vessel for the spirits of Wampanoag and other native people who were kidnapped and brought to England. And so the thought here is that because this object will be traveling to England and then returning to America, there was an opportunity there to address the reverse crossing, not the direction of the Mayflower, but the reverse crossing of native people who were taken against their will to a foreign land and then not allowed to return to their native soil. And therefore their spirits are in some sense not at rest because they're not present where they should be. And so this project is an attempt to address that. And as I've said, it in many ways, it serves as a kind of emotional and intellectual heart of the project. It's obviously a boat that responds to the image of the original Mayflower as a waterborne vessel. But also it's important to acknowledge Jonathan's role in the exhibition as somebody who was teaching us, the rest of us, about Wampanoag history, about perspectives, spirituality, and really became a kind of key advisor to many of the other artists and certainly to myself and the other members of the curatorial team. So I want to acknowledge his many contributions here. Really, this is not a project that could have happened in any sense without him. Then we have another series of works that images the boat, the vessel. This is a project that was initiated by Annette Bellamy, who is herself a fisherwoman as well as a sculptor, an artist, and spends a lot of time out on the water fishing for salmon. And when I invited her, she decided that the most appropriate way for her to respond to the brief was to invite 6 other artists, all of whom are Alaskan Indigenous people, to contribute their own vessels. And then Annette also contributed one of her own vessels. And so this is in a way a kind of exhibition within an exhibition. And it tells many stories that are particular to that part of the world and the belief systems of that part of the world. one of the things that we were very concerned to do in the show, and it was really helpful in thinking this through with me, was to absolutely not represent Native American culture as monolithic, which is often done even by well-meaning institutions and voices under conditions of white supremacy. There's a kind of, homogenization and effectively a kind of caricature that occurs. And so, of course, we were very aware that the Wampanoag community was particularly important to the story, having been the nation that the Mayflower colonizers encountered, but we did want to also reflect the perspective of other Native people who, of course, were affected at greater distance, but in many cases just as tragically and to just as great an extent as those who lived in what we now call New England, or was then Patuxet. This is the work that David Clarke, London-based metalsmith, contributed. It is called Portrait, so P-O-O-R-T-R-A-I-T, Portrait. And it takes its oval shape and approximate dimensions from a portrait that's now in the National Portrait Gallery of Pocahontas. So that's the derivation of the elliptical format. And David thought long and hard about what he wanted to do for the show, as all the other artists did, but he was thinking specifically about his own métier of being a metalsmith. And it occurred to him that the most important role that metal had in the story was in the context of weaponry, so guns and shot, bullets. So what he did was to take a very large number of lead balls, pellets, bullets essentially, and pound them flat into a linen backing, which is dyed with oak ball ink. And you can see the incredible detail of this, this texture of this object. And it, there's a lot of ways you could read this gesture. One way is as a kind of anti-portrait of the European colonizer that sort of reflects the violence of that action back on itself. You also might think of it as a kind of memorial object, almost like a kind of gravestone, although the fact that it's hovering might make you also think of it as a kind of mirror or portal. Like I think all the artists' work in the show, there's a kind of multivalence in this work, and it reflects both the pain and tragedy of the Mayflower story, and also something of its material solidity and anchoring of the history that we all inhabit still. So I think a very thoughtful and poignant and in many ways tough object, an object that reflects David's own journey through the project. Then we have Michelle Erickson, who I have to say in a way, she was kind of like a ringer in one regard, in the sense that her whole career has been based on the rediscovery of 17th and 18th century ceramic technologies. So what she has been doing for years and years is to look very carefully at historical and archaeological ceramics, and then essentially to reverse engineer them by making them herself using exactly the same techniques. And what she did in this case was to go one step further, because generally speaking, she had always fired her pieces in an electric or gas kiln. And what she did in this case was to use wood firing techniques, which of course are much more period appropriate. It's also interesting to note the iconography of these works. So she thought a lot about the history of shells, both as a medium of exchange and also as a medium of, or a sort of survival remnant of actual foodways. And people who know anything about native archaeology will know that these shell middens are often the kind of key indicators of a large native community having existed somewhere in the past when they've been displaced off of that land. So the use of these shells as an emblem on these pots is very much motivated by that sense of recapturing presence. And I should also say that after these images were taken, Jonathan James Perry, who again made the Machoon, made lids for these pieces, although they're not actually present in these photographs. So that was another really good example of a collaboration in the process of putting the show together. And then we have Katie Schwab, who made these two gestures of welcome, one of which is the welcome mat, which is the first thing that people will encounter when they enter the main gallery. The other is this piece, as I said before, this says, "Welcome, my friends." And this is a close-up of the nails. This is hundreds and hundreds of hand-wrought nails, incredible amount of work, incredible amount of labor. And then, you know, you can almost hear this sculpture, you can hear the banging of it being put into the wall, and think about that as a gesture. Of course, it reflects or suggests an idea of building, house building, and these are the kinds of nails that you would have had in, you know, planking for a 17th century house, or maybe even a piece of furniture, you know, putting a drawer together inside a chest, for example. But you also might think perhaps even of, you know, Christ being nailed to the cross. Certainly the idea of these sharp metal objects penetrating this surface, which reflects, I think, also on the kind of physical dynamics of David Clarke's piece. There seems to be an idea here of a kind of echo of invasion or defacement. And so, you know, the piece, the message of the piece offering this idea of welcome, but then in fact being made of this materiality that again is so multivalent and has a kind of violence built into it, I find incredibly moving. And, you know, as a gesture anchoring the back of the show, sort of the end of the show, if you like, this idea of a welcome that was, you know, offered in many cases by the Native Americans who lived here and then was, of course, exploited subsequently by the colonizers. And the degree to which we can still offer one another a gesture of welcome in a way that's justifiable or not, I find extremely suggestive and really worth meditating on. So to me, it's a really fitting conclusion to the show. And then we had hoped to have Jasleen Kaur here today on the panel, but she wasn't able to join us, but I will show you her work, of course. She, again, collaborated with another artist, Eleanor Lakeland, who is a British-based wood carver, to make these two objects which you know, offer themselves as symbols of the Mayflower story. There's the boat itself on the right, and then of course the turkey, which is from the myth of the first Thanksgiving, you know, which is again largely fictitious, but again sort of connects to this idea of welcoming or hospitality. And then what she did, here's some details of the woodwork of these two pieces. What she did was to put an infuser inside these objects so that they are smoking perpetually. The turkey in this kind of hilariously rude way. So a little note of comedy in what's otherwise a rather serious show. And again, there's lots of ways you could understand this gesture. Certainly it suggests a kind of ephemerality, maybe a sort of inner destruction, a burning away. But it's interesting to think about this idea of burning in relationship to the Machoon, and that is a kind of generative sort of burning out. You know, fire as a tool, fire as a way of making a functional object. And here you have this, you know, fictitious smoke. Makes you think of that saying, where there's smoke, there's fire, you know, so kind of indication of something. And I think of all the artists in the project, Jasleen was probably the one who was most interested in the way that the Mayflower has come down as a legend and something that's been replicated over and over again in the history making, the imagination really of America. And again, something that we always think about on Thanksgiving, or, you know, as we might instead call it, the National Day of Mourning, which is what many Indigenous communities call that day. So she was really engaging with that whole symbolic register of the Mayflower story. And and this is the last thing I'll say before turning over to the first of our artists, Sonya Clark. One of the things that we were thinking about a lot and that we engaged with in our study visits was that although the Mayflower's centenary in 1720 seems to have passed essentially without being noticed, already by 1820, it was a big deal. And it was when Pilgrim Hall was founded, for example, in Plymouth, and it was commemorated as a major event of historical imagination. And then to an even greater extent, the 300th anniversary in 1920 was celebrated as a kind of pageant of nationalism. Native communities very much not invited, except in a very kind of marginalized and ornamental way. And of course, this was right in the heart of the colonial revival, 1920. So that event was an opportunity for America to celebrate its own version of itself, I suppose, white America. And in so many ways, what we wanted to do was create an event that was another marking of another anniversary, but didn't have that kind of simple celebratory cast to it, that was instead layered, multidimensional, that reflected both on the importance of the story, and in some ways the kind of bravery and remarkable fortitude, and also the ideological conviction of this group of settlers who came on the Mayflower at great risk to themselves, of course, and many of them didn't survive the early years of settlement in Plymouth. But we also wanted to reflect all the other sides of that story, particularly the Native perspective, and really think about the full dimensions of what the Mayflower voyage has wrought in our lives down to the present day. So that's what I'm going to say. And now I have the great pleasure of welcoming Sonia to the digital stage. Sonia, hello.
So if you could go to the first slide for me, Glenn, I'd appreciate that. So the project that I made for Another Crossing was called Power Tools, Press, Text, Land, and Language. And I'm a textile artist. My roots are deeply, deeply engaged in textiles. And so, so this idea of whenever I work with text, I am also thinking about textiles. This is a piece that made me, that was based on some work that I had done really to interrogate the Roman alphabet, as a kind of Eurocentricity and white supremacy, a tool of white supremacy that almost becomes invisible in the same way that whiteness often becomes invisible. And knowing that the press, a printing press, was one of the things that was carried on the Mayflower to these indigenous lands. So I was thinking about those things. Prior to Glenn asking me to be part of this exhibit, I had interrogated the Roman alphabet by making a script that was based on the Roman alphabet, but really based on the curl pattern of my hair. That is to say, based on the curl pattern of a person of African descent's hair. And I was thinking about how Ngugi wa Thiong'o in 1986, in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, was engaging African indigenous authors to write in their own native languages, that is, to hold the wisdoms that were held in their own native languages and not to write in the languages of the colonizer. As a student, when I read that book in the 80s, this meant a lot to me, but then I also realized that when people wrote in the indigenous languages, often they would still be using the colonizer or the Eurocentric script of the Roman alphabet. And so that's when Twist came about. So what you're seeing for the piece, one of the two parts of the piece that I made for Power Tools, Press, Text, Land, and Language, are these handmade papers that were made in collaboration with Mary Hark, a Minneapolis-based and Wisconsin-based paper maker. The paper is made out of linen and cotton, and also has earth from what we now call Plymouth, Massachusetts, but is in fact, in the Wampanoag language, Patuxet. So that's embedded in these handmade papers. And then the text on the papers, and you can go to the next slide, Glenn. So this is, so I'll talk about the text on the papers in a moment, but Glenn's charge to us was to use a technology that already existed in 1620. And so I went to hot metal type. I worked with Ed Raher at Swamp Press using the Twist font that I developed. So this is an A that you see on the left that's printed, the hot lead type that you see that Ed cast for me, a little curl of my own natural hair, and then the Roman alphabet of the letter A. And so what you see on the front, on the left-hand side, is the letter A as it is in the Twist alphabet that I developed in partnership, in collaboration with a graphic designer by the name of Bo Peng, and the Roman alphabet letter A on the right, and then the hot metal type done in Ed Raher's Swamp Press. This opportunity gave me this charge, Glenn's homework for us gave me the opportunity to not only have twist as a digital font, but to actually make it into hot metal type. So here is the whole alphabet. Again, sort of in collaboration with Audre Lorde, using the master's tools to undo the master's house. It is a 26-letter alphabet, but in this case, all of the letters are made again from based on the curl pattern of an African person's hair. And so here you see it. You can see this is a lexicon, and this lexicon actually also, or the key, it also exists in the many pieces that were printed. And you can go, just to give you a sense, the word that's printed at the top says twist, and then of course the alphabet is there. And then I went about thinking about what text I actually wanted to use. And I was thinking about why those who came over on the Mayflower bought a printing press. And one of the reasons that they brought the printing press was to spread the word in the Bible. And so I went to the Wampanoag Bible, which was a Bible written in a King James Version that had been translated into Wampanoag and edited by a Wampanoag to make sure that it was correct. And so I used text from that and printed it in the Roman alphabet. Next slide, please. And then I also used text from people like, this is from Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was born in Massachusetts. He was a whaler and an abolitionist. He was a mixed heritage. His father was Ashanti from West Africa. His mother was Wampanoag. So he feels like family. And this felt like a very important text to bring forth. So you see his words are written in the Roman alphabet. His name is written in twist. Next slide, please. And then my colleague, Lisa Brooks, who is a brilliant Native American scholar. She is in fact also Native American. And this is from her book, The Common Pot. And I asked Lisa if it was okay if I could also write her text in twist as well. And she said, of course, we're all family. So I hope you had at least a little bit of time to read something of this text about how histories form and communal histories form. I should mention that there are other texts in that overall shot of the text that you saw, also from William Apis as well. So that's included. And then finally, there is earth that has been gathered from what we call Plymouth, but is actually Patuxet, and spelling the word Patuxet in earth. I do note that in the Boston Globe, the review of our show mentioned that I had made this piece thinking that the earth would be erased or somehow diminished over time. And I have to say that that was not my intent as an artist. I like to think that we're older, people will say that something is like as old as dirt. And so my sense is actually that the earth holds our histories, not that those histories get erased or that they disappeared, but in fact that the word Patuxet written in the earth of people, the Wampanoag people, is holding that history, never letting it go. So thank you.
I'm so appreciative that you recognize all of the collaborators, which are both, I guess I want to say, technical artistic collaborators and also intellectual collaborators, and even Paul Cuffey might be construed to be a collaborator in a sense. So all of these voices joining in the project, and it's something that came up over and over again in the show. As you said, there's hundreds of people in a way who are reflected in the show.
Yeah, Glenn, can I say one more thing about that? I have to say that the conversations that I had with Jonathan Perry and all of the artists who were in that first study trip were just so fruitful for me. And Jonathan's sister Elizabeth is with us today, and she has actually brought her wisdom to some of my classes as well. So I'm really grateful for the generative nature of the creative minds, those both living and those ancestral and those yet to come.
Great, thank you so much, Sonia. So Jeffrey.
Thanks for being here. I haven't seen Sonia and Allison in some time, so it's really great to see your faces. And we finally got to show together, so that's good. Yeah, I was really excited when Glenn contacted me. It's been obviously a wild year for everybody, and unfortunately I haven't been able to take part in everything to the degree that I would have wanted to. But it did coincide with some things that were already going on in the studio. In 2019, really in an effort to kind of both broaden the materials that I use in my work, but also to encourage specificity about tribally identified materials. I started working with river cane from the southeastern part of the continent, and basketry is something that I'm most familiar with in weaving from both my mother's tribe, the Cherokee in Oklahoma, and my father's tribe, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. So that was someplace where I wanted to start immediately. And then the other material that I wanted to work with, again, back in 2019, was porcupine quills, which is sort of a material that I think I was just scared of. I just didn't even know how to begin approaching how to work with porcupine quills. And so that kicked that off. We can go to the first slide. And so back in 2019 at the exhibition, The Anthropophagic Effect at the New Museum, was the first time I showed work that used both river cane and also porcupine quills. And so when Glenn approached me with the idea for this exhibition, I wasn't really thinking so much about the kind of historic timeline of these materials, but it gave me an opportunity to think about what are other things that I could use in my practice. The amazing thing about, when I was learning about weaving reed, we started with basketry, and with basketry, I was really blown away by the fact that it's one of the most sculptural materials that I've worked with, and how much it is mendable, and you can continue adding length, so you're not actually limited at all by the length of the reed. It's sort of a process of attaching and weaving, but you can really sculpt whatever form you want. And so what you're looking at here are 3 masks, headpieces, and it was kind of a continuation of the pieces that I showed at the New Museum. And you can see any of this could be applied to a basket. We were working on head forms that we made here in the studio, and the materials around the eyes are actually porcupine quills that have been embedded through birch bark. So this was all really like an opportunity for me to just start thinking about, well, normally, I might use like an air dry clay. What's another material which existed at the time? Birch bark is another thing that we also began to explore in 2019. But here it made the perfect kind of surface for the face. And so, yeah, it's amazing. The porcupine quills are literally, they're 2 holes, and then you kind of stick the porcupine quill in, and it's almost like a staple on the back. And we were, in the past, we work with archival adhesives, and this time I was talking, it has to do with the technology of making water-sealed canoes and working with ash and with resins. And so we started working with pine resin and pinon resin and beeswax, and we learned how to make different, and this is when I say we, it's me and the studio team that I work with here, how to make different consistencies for adhesives using resin and beeswax. And so everything is adhered that needed to have adhesive with that combination. And it's also amazing, it smells incredible. And we also found that you could add, I don't think it shows up in these headpieces, but you can add pigments to it. And so we did order at the time many different earth pigments. So we realized we could make adhesives in anywhere from, reds to greens, blues, and yellows very easily. And so that was really exciting. The kind of adornment on here is not just the shape of the headpiece, but it's also, here we have lapis, the blue, and jasper. So I was just writing this down to make sure I don't forget. And I think it's tiger's eye on the bottom. And, I think the kind of narrative that I was giving myself was thinking about how different queer histories have been erased since contact in the retelling of the narratives of Indigenous people. And so, the idea of who are these masks for, and kind of coincides with my kind of an element of my practice that's about kind of giving oneself the entitlement to imagine these gaps in history, or these gaps in the narratives that we have learned. And I think it's because we've been told what the histories have been, oftentimes from an archaeological or anthropological perspective. From an anthropological perspective, I think in many ways, what I see sometimes is a sort of almost like atrophy of what I refer to as like an imagination muscle to kind of like author our own stories. And so the next step of this project, well, let me come back to this. So we'll go to the next slide. So here's another one. And, when these masks were being created, I was really just working in process. So with what the read allows you to do is kind of create a form, put it on somebody, and work very much like sculpturally, like let's wrap this back around, let's make these shapes, and to think about them as sculptures. It's always important to me in my own work. I appreciate when people work specifically from history, but in my own work, I think it's always important to think of myself as a present day continuation of these histories. So not to necessarily recreate something of the past, or maybe something that I didn't grow up with, but to use these materials and who I am to try to make something in the present, right? And so for me, thinking about this like kind of secret society, or maybe not even secret society, of like queer people having a dinner party was my jumping off point. So what would we wear? Well, if I was commissioned to make the masks for this meal, this would be it. And we would be sitting around eating local foods and pulling some fish up out of the water, and we would be gossiping, and we would be, I don't know, hatching plans, but we would be laughing. I think the idea of joy and humor, and thinking about the queer communities that I've been a part of during my lifetime, the craft of humor and the craft of kind of high conversation and kind of like moving back and forth across so many things, and the kind of slyness of it is something that I'd like to think existed in our native tongue. I'd like to think existed in our native context, and I'd like to think it's a long time history of crafting what I still see today, even with all the changes in terms of how we think about queerness from my youth to present. I still very much appreciate that. And there's also its own kind of like passing down of stories from like elders to young people. In this one, there's freshwater pearl, turquoise, garnet, abalone, brass, and I believe there's some porcupine quill, and then birch bark and reed. And this is an image. Glenn, did we put more than one in? So we did what was originally like a photo shoot, which I like to photograph people in both the garments and the masks, as a way of thinking about an artist's kind of biography. When we think about historians researching an artist, and we get to stumble across, who did they eat dinner with, and who did they photograph, and who was in their studio. And I work actively to try to bring queer, Indigenous, and people of color into my life, and hopefully document them having engaged in my work and in my thinking, in hopes that we're laying the ground for a future that doesn't have these gaps in terms of who we are and how we negotiate and kind of operate in the world. And so, the only step that we actually didn't get to with these masks had to do with thinking about of the time period, how people would have recorded happenings. So whether it was drawings done by Indigenous people, or even potentially drawn by early colonizers, was another element that is something that I might explore in the future. People wearing these and then being drawn in a sort of journalistic way. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so Allison, coming to us from California, is next.
I want to just start by expressing my gratitude to be living and working on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands here in Yalamu, aka San Francisco, and just to pay respect to local elders and the spirits of the lands that I'm on. For many years, I had been doing work around the role of craft in constructions of identity, the idea of reenactment culture as this performative kind of practice of constructing whiteness, masculinity, nationalism. And I had seen or sort of theorized reenactment culture or living history culture as this kind of acting out of unresolved cultural trauma through traditional craft and a kind of ritualized performance, this kind of never ending, persistent sort of performance. So I think I wasn't surprised to get the invitation to partake in this show, both because of the historical element and the craft element, but yet it was probably the most challenging, prompt that I'd ever received. And it really just came to me at a time when a lot of other layers, kind of deeper layers of accountability in my practice and in my life had started to emerge, or to converge, I should say. Both trying to seek a deeper, connection to the lands I'm on and the source of all of my materials, and this idea of kind of the vibrancy of matter, and going deeper in terms of my processes and materials, and just deeper individual work around interrogating and divesting from white supremacy and decolonization. I also gave birth to a child with Indigenous roots from the Sac and Fox tribal nation in 2014. And so my partner, Christine, and I also have been trying to understand what it means to be guardians of his sovereignty. And when the show idea came along, I think I was already thinking a lot about animism and this kind of fear of animism that seems to really come to a head with the sort of proto-capitalist, just like pre-colonization of Turtle Island, North America, where you start to see the enclosure of the commons, you see the witch hunts, you see the monetization of land as resource alongside the monetization of people as labor. And so I got really interested in understanding how I could go about a kind of earth reconnection, historical reconnection to a time sort of before the Troubles. And so this idea of time travel has always been really interesting to me. And I think I've always, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of emphasis on ancestor reverence of, these ties to the Mayflower, to early colonization. And that was considered kind of a point of pride and very much participating in kind of mythologizing narratives. And I think as a queer kid growing up, I felt a really intense sense of sort of shame and, anxiety around that. And so in my own practice, looking at, historical reenactment, I've tried to bring a critical lens to that, but also a very psychological, sort of a desire to understand the psychological underpinnings of those narratives. So I feel like a lot of my work has been motivated by a sense of accountability around the harms of my ancestors, but in this project, I had a chance to really peel back many, many more layers to that. So one of the first things that I went about doing for the project was to kind of reconceptualize a family tree. As I said, I have a lot of information about ancestors. And so I don't know if you can really tell very well from this image, but essentially I started gathering all of the information that I had in order to create a diagram that would show essentially all of the known names of ancestors going back to cover what turns out to be 13 generations and 400 years, back to the Mayflower crossing, in order to kind of arrive at a sort of portrait, so to speak, of those blood lineages. And I wonder, So in this image on the right, you see kind of this star formation. And if you were able to see it up close, or you were able to see the object in the show, you would see this is, all of these kind of known names, starting with myself at the center. And this is sort of an inversion of the kind of family tree that I was grown up to revere, which is this idea of like several important people and then all of their, all of us descendants kind of coming from them. But when you reverse that and just go from parents to parents, you find that there's over, 4,000 people that needed to get together to make me, in this life. And so with this chart, I started to kind of map these various troubles. So the threads that you see in this version, it's printed on linen. And so I started to try to, think about this idea of epigenetics and the way that trauma is carried across generations. And so in my case, in my ancestors' case, thinking about traumas both inflicted and experienced, and thinking about this idea of moral injury, the kind of moral injury that is its own type of trauma that I feel most or many white folks carry, whether or not they try to look at that specifically. So what you see in these threads here, for example, they are used to denote someone who crossed over from one culture to another, someone who broke with their culture of origin, someone who experienced armed conflict and its consequences firsthand, someone who was charged of or suspected of murder, someone who owned a plantation, or someone responsible for enslavement of others who claimed human beings as property, a child who lost a parent before the child reached the age of 15, or a parent who lost a child before the child reached the age of 15, people who experienced sudden tragic death, all sorts of other kind of criteria. And I should say this is ongoing, mental illness or incarceration for that, as well as roles, individuals' roles as ministers, teachers, police officers, or spies. So I mentioned that I've had this long kind of connection with traditional craft, and often I will undertake apprenticeships so again, this show was very perfect for my way of working. And in this, the process of this show, I apprenticed with a high priestess of Wicca, and as well as a priest who specializes in this notion of ancestral lineage repair. And so some of these objects in the show are kind of hearkening to, as I mentioned, sort of that idea of witchcraft and animism, but also this idea that there's a way of using these kind of objects as magical tools for personal and collective transformation. So a different kind of ritual than I was thinking of with reenactment, but one sort of infused with that psychosocial sort of quality. This is a wand. This is actually made from a piece of branch that I found at the grave site of some of my earliest ancestors in Bicester in England. I was thinking of this kind of queer wand in which you have this notion of the law of returns, this kind of doubling or returning kind of back on itself. And this is a double besom broom. So again, thinking about this idea of crossing over, another crossing as crossing over between worlds, between genders, between time frames, and this idea of hedge writing became really interesting to me. So this is a double besom broom. The broomstick is made from a branch from like I said, the grave site of ancestors in Bicester, England. And so essentially I see this as a tree that grew from out of the literal blood and bones of my ancestors who were buried there in the graveyard. And then the bristles for the broom are Mayflower, hawthorn from a local creek near where I live now. So this is another object that I think of as kind of a ritual object for basically using this chart for kind of divination practices or kind of spiritual, there's lots of different words for it, but essentially a sort of healing process where I can go into a kind of meditative space to commune or to communicate with these troubled ancestors in my lineages. So this is called a high bell candlestick. And I had seen an image of this object that was at auction at Sotheby's that was from this time period, from right around 1620. And I was really fascinated with the idea of this candlestick that was also a bell. And so I worked with some pewter workers in Sheffield, England, which I understand to be an area of England known for its metal work. And they were able to create kind of a historical reproduction. And at the last minute, when I asked to make sure that the clapper, was inside of it, I realized that the candlestick probably wasn't originally a bell, but I was so fascinated by that we went ahead, with that idea. And so in a kind of ritual practice where you might use a bell to clear energy or to call in spirits, or you might use a candle again to cast spells or wishes or intentions, or as well as just the use of fire to kind of cleanse a space. Those were things I was thinking about with that object. So I'm thinking of this as it's a summoner, and it's to use to contact my summoner line of ancestors. And I would say it's an example of like a master's tool that I'm trying to kind of think of differently. And so when I visited the Pilgrim Hall on our research trip, and I saw Constance Hopkins' hat, and I just so happened, there was a lot of serendipity with this project, but on that day, my sister had let me know that there was a connection with our family to the Hopkins family. And I immediately saw that hat at Pilgrim Hall, and I was like, that's my witch hat, like that's my hat. And so for this project, I turned a hat block on a lathe, and I worked with a hat maker. There's different locations, but to try to recreate as close as I could Constance Hopkins' hat. And then in the next slide, you can see from above, in place of the kind of chipped edges of the current hat, I put in a phrase, constantly returning to the harms of my ancestors. Yeah, so much more to say, and just again, just so much gratitude to everyone and for this project.
Thank you so much, Allison. I don't know if we should call it a family tree or a family structure, but that image seems so resonant to me in that each of us, of course, given time and sufficient information, could draw it for ourselves. And it just shows how many adjacencies and contingencies you have as a person before you even come into the world. It's just been fascinating to be kind of on the doorstep as and listening to you as you've gone on this journey of, in a way, self-discovery, if I can put it that way, and all of these amazing things that have happened to you along the way. It's almost like the stuff of a novel, really. Going to Plymouth Plantation and realizing that you were being confronted with somebody who was basically portraying your own ancestor, in complete with costume and period dialogue. So it's been a very sort of wild ride, but obviously has resulted in really incredible works as well. So thank you. Okay, and then finally we have Christine and Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth.
Waniki Sak. My name is Elizabeth James Perry. I'm a tribal member of the Aquinnah tribe on Martha's Vineyard, or Nope, as we say. And I'm primarily a shell worker and traditional plant grower and processor. So I do a lot of textiles, natural dyes. And my wampum work that you see pictured here is really a combination of those two disciplines. It's a traditional art form that goes way, way, way back. And in addition to using those materials, we also use, as you might have inferred from Gibson's talk, porcupine quills as well in the Americas for our art, in woven art as well. The first engagement I had with the Another Crossing group was actually to demonstrate Indigenous arts to the group that was coming here to the Fuller Craft Museum to do some research and prep for designing pieces for this exhibit. And I brought my traditional wampum making tools and shell and process and some of my art. And very quickly, people had questions that weren't actually particularly focused on wampum, which has a rich tradition on its own as a material of ceremony and adornment and protection and history keeping, memory keeping. But the questions were coming from European people visiting Massachusetts and other New England states about why things are the way they are here. Folks were asking me, where are the Native people? Why don't I see Indian people all over the place when I'm driving around? Why don't I see names? Why don't I hear the language? And I said, well, we were colonized, and it was very effective. And I said, there are Native people around. However, the reality is sometimes as a Native person, even in the 21st century, you pick and choose when you are going to bring that identity to the fore. And there are situations where it definitely is not an asset, and you might choose to just keep that bit of information to yourself and pass as an unusual looking Italian lady, which I've done. So the discussion turned to more serious things about our shared history as Native people and as Europeans. And then we kind of moved around to materials and sustainability. And I talked about being mindful of sourcing. And so being real conscious about the abundance of the plants that I'm working with. And if they're not common anymore, there are things that I try to get the seeds for and grow in my property so that I can not take any from the wild when they're getting so rare, because it's a very developed area. Sustainability, let's just say, isn't one of the things that was brought with the Pilgrims when they came in 1620. I'll just put that out there. And so I try to be really careful, like a lot of tribal artists. And, you know, it's about having a relationship with place and with materials and with art forms that come from tradition, but that are not strictly governed, you know. So I might try to do creative things and instill a piece with my own insight and experience and reactions to situations in the moment, you know, rather than simply sitting down and copying a piece in a collection or an old family piece. And so I'm not sure if there's another photo of my current cuff. I should have asked.
Maybe what we could do is welcome Christine to the screen, and then Elizabeth, can we get back to you after Christine explains her part in the project? Does that make sense?
That would be fine. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, Christine, hello.
Yeah, so we went on 2 research trips. I have to say the first one was to the UK and the second one was to the US. And to explain a later on conversation with Elizabeth, I must talk about one of the conversations with the artist I had with the whole group at breakfast in the UK, because it was very much about ancestry. And I was saying, well, it was quite an intense discussion where I said I didn't feel my Dutchness was very important, or my ancestors were not very much a part of my way of working, or and so people were reacting quite intensely to that. And yeah, I thought it was a really great conversation because we were really open and honest, and it felt like I could say that, and I felt like there's something wrong about what I'm saying, but it was good to be honest, because there were reactions, for instance, also from Allison, that really sort of hit me. And then later on we went to the US and I met Elizabeth, and yeah, she showed me the work that is here, and I was really interested in wampum, but understood that that's very much not a part of my history, of course. And I thought the question was really difficult to do something with a craft from the 16th, 17th century, because working with a native craft would be very strange for me to do, but working with a craft from the Netherlands or a material from that time, which I normally do often, like linen or wool, would also feel very wrong. So I was a little bit sort of in between things. And then I met Elizabeth and we had a really, really nice conversation. And yeah, I was just really impressed with her work and also the conversation. And I thought this project should really be about conversations and talking to each other. And then when I came home, I re-looked at my photos and I saw Elizabeth's cuff again. And I noticed the red bead. And we went to the Pequot Museum and there was a Dutch tradesman in the museum, a doll, a really scary Dutch guy holding beads in his hand. Like really interesting because it's like a museum not from Dutch perspective. So it was interesting to see like a really scary person, because we would like, it's interesting how you in a Dutch museum you wouldn't see that. But anyway, he was holding these beads, and then I started researching and I found out that it's the making of the beads is a technique that was invented around 1590. And there are beads that were found in Amsterdam and in North America from the same strand. And this technique is a technique that was invented then in Europe for using as trade with native people all around the world. And for me as a product designer, that is really interesting because it's like an early example of mass production. It's far before the Industrial Revolution, and it's like a way to produce loads of beads. And I have a feeling that from our history, this was very much seen as something that is just an object of trade. And I feel that we didn't understand the value of the object then, and probably we still don't, because there's been, like when people talk about beads, it's always a bit like as if it's worth nothing, just the monetary value. And I thought this was so interesting. And then I asked Elizabeth if she wanted to join me on a research project about the trade route, but to also look at what the trade route looks like now, because it's still intact. And there's in the Czech Republic, there's a factory where the beads are still made. And then, yeah, so Elizabeth luckily said yes, and we had just really many super interesting conversations, which I think is where the value of this project lies. And the goal was to make a map of the modern trade route of the bead, all the way from where it was made and the materials it was made from into Elizabeth's cuff. Well, we made new things. So this was the cuff that it all started with, but Elizabeth created a new one. And yeah, so it was very much about how a trade route is formed in the now in a sort of unconnected way, because people who are working in the Czech Republic, for instance, I went there and because we have a funding for making a film about this project, which is kind of stuck because of Corona, but we filmed the beginning, and I met a woman who was 80 years old and had been stringing beads in the Czech Republic since she was 7. And so I think it's so interesting that all around the route, there are people whose lives are made of a part of it, but they never meet each other. So this project is really about trying to make connections. So what this is actually, this is not the work, it's the packaging of the work. I thought the map should not be a fixed map, it should be a flexible map. And it's a map that is about the route that this technique is making through time. So for each year, there is one bead. And if they are stuck on a little foot, and underneath the foot there is the year. So if you, it's like the work is like a conversation piece, because if you would unpack this, and Elizabeth and I talked about it, and it was really nice because you talk about year numbers, then everybody will have a different version of what happened in that year. And each year from 1590 till now, these beads were traded. So I hope very much for the future also that this is going to be a sort of living work, that anywhere you can unpack it and make a bead route at that spot, and that we will have many conversations, Elizabeth and I, of course, but also with people talking about different years and what happened in those years. So here you see the beginning. So it's also basically a technique demonstration. So you can see the glass being pulled, and the first ones are like these rocky shape. Yeah, this is how the beads, they are like rounded and they are pulled finer and finer and finer. And then finally we end up in Elizabeth's cuff. And just one more thing, and then I will give the word back to Elizabeth. One day, just really randomly, Elizabeth emailed me, does the word texel mean anything to you? And I was like, it just came out of nowhere. And I was like, texel. Like, I have sons, but if I would have had a daughter, her name would have been Texel, because my grandmother comes from Texel. And so, yeah, so then now I give the word to Elizabeth so she can explain why she asked about Texel.
Yeah, so part of my practice is not only listening to oral traditions and family traditions, community knowledge, working with other Native artists, but also doing some research, going to archives, going to museums and looking at Eastern collections and rare Eastern objects. And I have a fascination with maps because they often contain interesting bits of information. And looking at maps, I found that Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, sometimes they were portrayed as the same island or connected. Sometimes it was Nantucket, sometimes it was just Martha's Vineyard. But often in early maps, especially that were Dutch, the island was labeled Texel. And for me, that was an interesting puzzle because our Indigenous language, Wampanoag, doesn't have any L's. It doesn't even have any R's. And so I knew that that really wasn't our word for any of the communities on the island or the island itself. And I was trying to find the origin. And so hence my question, and it cleared a lot up, and it made sense conceptually that there's a small island by a mainland that's a really convenient stop-off point that's distinctive, good places to trade and to get supplies as a mariner. Yeah, it kind of clicked for me. And then it added an interesting layer of connection and history to our collaborative project as well, I think.
Well, that's an amazing coincidence, although in some ways I think, and also thinking back to Allison's map, maybe what it suggests is that if people start talking to one another in new and different configurations, then these kinds of coincidences start to seem more like the norm than the exception. In other words, we have a lot more connections to one another than we know or tend to recognize. And in so many ways, that's what this project is about. And I really feel like your collaboration with one another, Elizabeth and Christine, is very much, a pure distillation of what I hoped would happen in the show. And, we've heard so many names in addition to the 10 artists who are involved. So many other people have had a part to play in this project. But your work together has been particularly intense and creative and generative, and it's just been a marvel to see. So thank you both for being involved, and it's been such a pleasure to see you work together. I did think, though, it would be great to have a little bit of conversation amongst ourselves, just as a group of artists and one curator, before we take some questions. And I'm sort of inclined to kind of open the floor to what you all are thinking at this point, rather than be more directive than that. So each of you have gotten to hear probably stuff you didn't know about one another's work and the processes that you've each engaged in, because the last research visit was, well over a year ago now because of the delays that we've had. And we've all, as I've said, been on quite a journey together. So what are you all thinking now, now that the show is up, now that the Mayflower, the marking of this anniversary, at least our part of it, has been completed at the Fuller. What are you feeling? What are you seeing in each other's works? I'd love to know what's on your minds.
I'm happy to say something. Yeah. I think, it's interesting because had this exhibition happened in any other time, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago, I might feel really differently. But I think the context of just global American Western culture and all the conversations around race and equity, and then for me personally, just indigeneity on top of that, I feel like it's at least in the way that I think about the work that I'm drawn to and the work that I hope to make and put out in the world, it's made it more challenging in a way, and maybe there's an added layer of responsibility to what contributing to these conversations means, but also I think feeling responsible to not, this is our opportunity to push these conversations as far forward as we can, while they're maybe more in the forefront of people's minds than I've experienced in the past. And also, you know, it's emotionally really kind of like, it's difficult to think about these issues without there being any real mechanism for reparations in many ways. And so I think there's always been this kind of line between, you know, political art and why do we do it and why do we take on these larger ideas, like what's the final kind of impact. And I think also, you know, I have two children, and I think thinking about kind of how to shift the conversation or start a new conversation maybe with new voices, and to kind of give new voices entitlement in that new conversation. Trying to make work that is maybe a new jumping off point for them, so we don't necessarily have to repeat the conversations of the last 50 years would be amazing. So I think that that's good. I mean, but it is just exhausting, I have to say. It's just exhausting. And I know for me over the last, in particular 2 years, having had to like sort of like step out every now and again, because I don't always want to be the person going like, but, you know, like, and so I know right now it was really great to like hear, you know, I'm familiar with Allison and Sonia's work mostly. I've known it for probably over a decade at this point, certainly with Allison. And it's great to see people kind of push these ideas along before they were at the forefront of people's minds. But, and Glenn, I would include you in that. And Elizabeth and I have not actually had the chance to meet each other in person yet, but I think there's plenty of opportunity for that to happen. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I have to say is like, one of the things I'm looking around at right now with a lot of institutions deciding to focus on these topics, you know, at least since my time, let's say in undergrad, you know, I've been pushing these ideas in, whether it was my professors or museum directors or curators or writers. And although I'm glad that this is happening, I'm also like, did it really take like contemporary, national, global trauma for people to like feel the urgency of this? And I think that in many ways, I hope that that's not the case going forward, because in many ways we can be much more proactive and effective when the world's not in absolute chaos.
Sonia, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say 150,000 years. The beads have been around. And again, just another shout out to Elizabeth, who came to give a lecture to my beading class in the middle of COVID. And we wanted to, I'm teaching a class, it's virtual, but it was, you know, Amherst students. So I said, we have to start here. Let's just start where we are collectively, at least our minds. And that was, we really appreciated that, Elizabeth, starting with the bead. So I teach a whole class on beadwork and the history of beads. And I learned so much from Elizabeth. Was our first visitor, and I thought I knew stuff, but you know, you always find that you know even less the more you speak with other people, which is a beautiful thing. So I really appreciate seeing everybody's work, and I also appreciate the sort of generative nature of it. But Jeffrey, I wanted to ask you a question about this. I just love this. You said something about like the slyness of language and the like queering of language, but the like the slyness of language. And I was thinking you know, that it's not only just in conversation, but also in the way that language is held in objects, right? You know, like one of the things, and to throw it back to Elizabeth and Christien, like one of the things about beads is that the class I teach is called Talking with Beads, because they've been around for so long that people actually speak through the material of beads. Or like code with them, or put metaphors in them, or they become metaphor themselves, and all of that, you know. So I was just thinking about this idea of the slyness of the object and the slyness of language as you said it. I'm not even sure that you realized that you said that, but I wrote it down. I just loved it so much. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, that really comes out of just sort of like what happens when like queer people get together and like kiki and just sort of like talk smack with each other and like find clever ways to sort of both celebrate and mock each other, you know. And but when I think about it now, it's interesting. What it brings up for me is that we do that in Western and American culture due to rejection, you know, and having to like being forced to kind of create our own kind of culture as an effect of having been rejected. And I think I saw one of the questions about like, are there queer people in like historically within Indigenous communities? And, you know, it's interesting because like queer is a contemporary term, you know, and even in my lifetime, it's changed radically. And most Indigenous nations, you know, have their own term for other genders, other gender identifications outside of male and female. And I don't want to romanticize the past and think that like we were wholly embraced, because I don't know. You know, we don't know. Somebody asked me the other day if I could be a time traveler, would I like to go in the future or in the past? And I said, well, kind of neither, because if I went to the future, my greatest hope would be that things would have radically changed and I could be horribly disappointed. And in the past, I was like, you know, being a queer person with a family, who knows what my situation would have been. And so maybe, you know, 5 minutes, 500 years ago, that was like. So I think language for me, you know, my resistance to language for a very long time in the beginning of my career was that it presents itself and it's used with such authority, like we know what it means. But in actuality, when it goes out into the world, it's very slippery, it's very subjective, it's very time-based and very specific to circumstance. And that's what I love about it. And I think, you know, whether it's through rejection or not, the queer communities that I've been a part of, whether it's in lyrics, poetry, you know, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, you know, the language is, yeah, it has many, many layers when it's crafted well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that.
So we're now at 4:30, and I wonder if we should take some questions from the audience. Would that be a good idea? One is for Elizabeth, actually. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth, you're trying to take a drink of water. Sorry, but someone just wanted to know who did that amazing picture on the wall behind you. I think we should definitely let them know.
It's Peter Boom. He's from the Northwest Coast. He's quite a talented printmaker and carver, so definitely look him up.
And how do you spell his last name, Peter?
Boom, B-O-O-M, I believe.
Okay.
I think he Erickson maybe is the name of his gallery, something like that.
Yeah, okay. And then a question, which I guess maybe would be best answered by Christine, is what are the red beads made of? And the answer is glass, but there's a lot more to say than that, of course.
Actually, we went to the sand mine that is very close to the bead factory. And we weren't allowed in because Corona had just started. So we were standing outside it, but then our drone could film above it. So we have a really beautiful start for the film where you can see the trucks taking the sand. And the reason that for this material is that the beads used to be produced in Venice and Amsterdam, but because of the sand mines in the Czech Republic, as well as trees that they could use for making the glass, the production changed. So we could see the sand. Then they didn't want to tell me the ingredients for the colors, because I thought Elizabeth and I would be very much interested in if the redness was still the same as it was or where it came from. But I had the bead analyzed by a Dutch historical center. So they could tell me what was in it. So we know the modern bead, but it's a totally different different recipe. And it's, yeah, of course, it's slightly changed color, but there are images of the like when in Amsterdam something is built, they sometimes find the old beads. They look exactly similar with the red and the white inside, and it's really been around for a long time like that.
Great, thank you. As you can tell, there's a lot of research behind that project, and indeed all the projects in the show. And that relates to another question that we had, which is for Allison, and well, it's sort of for you, Allison. The question is, why can we not do an Allison family graph for everyone who contributed to the project? And I think that might be a good cue to you to explain what was involved in putting that graph together, because it kind of looks like, oh, you could Google it, but that is obviously not the case.
I'm still remembering, maybe like some of you, different collaborators that I didn't give credit to. So I guess one of the collaborators for this would have to be my grandfather, my grandmother, my sister, like people in the family who had started to do genealogical research. Back in the day, it was like going to the Historical Society or getting involved in these different organizations. But so this is an Illustrator file, essentially the whole file that shows all of the names, but also all of the unknown names. So as I said, we are descended from a few people. It's exponential. So during the period of colonization that we're talking about, this would be like all of those people. So it's over 4,000 people. And so this is still in process as I continue to do this research. And every single day, I think, because genealogy has also emerged as a science, and that's a shift, and through online, websites like ancestry.com or, other ones where people are getting their DNA tested and things like that. And plus just the digitization of records means that like every day that goes by, there's more and more information that can be found, and you might be surprised at what you can find in obscure books and journals and things like that. So there's a lot of research, and then I worked with 2 different graphic designers to create this file. And ultimately, I'm hoping to animate this. It's kind of like a visualization project. So each layer of this is able to be independently, like the colors can be turned on and off, and it'll become kind of a larger project, like what I end up doing with it. But essentially, if I were to print this document where the smallest font is like the furthest point, let's say on the diagram is like a 6-point font, it would have to be about 12 feet wide to be readable as a physical map. And so I would say that, there were many hundreds of hours that went into creating the diagram with graphic designers, which of course completely breaks with the prompt of the 1620 technology, but it kind of became like the key to my my work. And I would say just many, I don't know, thousands of hours before that of the collective mass project of people trying to figure this out. So I don't know if that answers it, or.
Right. And actually that relates sort of to another question that we got, which is about Jasleen's use of the smoke emitting technology in her 2 pieces, and obviously there were no moisture based gaseous infusers in the early 17th century. So one thing that might be worth saying is that I kind of left it up to each artist to decide where they wanted to draw the boundaries on that prompt of the period technology. And it was maybe more important to me that there was some sense of engagement with the prompts, however that might be interpreted, rather than that it have some element of kind of unreasonable strictness. So I wasn't really trying to draw a line around anything. It was more trying to like offer a reason to plant a new flag or a new center and sort of grow from there. So that was more the logic of it, I suppose. There's some other questions about kind of curatorial process, but first, because it's an important topic, I thought Sonia and Elizabeth, we could talk a little bit about the Wampanoag Bible. So we got a couple of questions about that from Deborah Santoro, who asks, in the process, I'm not sure if you can read this, Sonia, but I'll just read it out so everyone knows. It says, in the process of your research, did you have the opportunity to see the Algonquin Wampanoag Bible in print rather than online, or any of the original type? There were several First Nations printers who worked with John Eliot in particular Lisa Brooke mentions Wawaus in her book, Our Beloved Kin. Did his uncredited presence in the work influence your thinking as you conceived of these pieces? And then Deborah also mentions that Elizabeth, you might want to say something about that Bible. So if you have anything to add, please do. But Sonia first, would you like to comment on that and the actual physical object?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I didn't have access to one of the Wampanoag Bibles. Though I will say that Amherst College, where I am an alum and also an employee, they have a pretty great collection of texts. But for me to actually figure out which part of the text I was going to use, I was searching it online, and then I actually have this book right here. Like, I didn't even leave my seat. It's right here. I'm a big fan of so this is Our Beloved Kin, which I don't have the questions up, so I don't see who asked that question, but yeah, if you haven't read works by either of any of the books by Lisa Brooks, then I highly, highly recommend them. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
Yeah, Elizabeth, would you like to say anything about the Wampanoag Bible as an artifact and its importance?
Sure. Yeah, and I can also talk about my relationship to that as well, and that history. I find the Bibles really fascinating. They've been really, really useful for our language program. We have a language reclamation program. So rebuilding a lot and recapturing concepts and philosophies that are somehow embedded in this Christian document. It's very interesting and very complicated. I also have a look at some of these Bibles. I've looked at the one at Pilgrim Hall. I went to the library company in Philadelphia for a Lenape exhibit that I was participating in. I created a modest wampum belt for the fall and the rise of Conestoga. And quite unexpectedly, I found that they had a Wampanoag Bible in their collection owned by one of the Papana. And I had known a woman from that family when I was quite a bit younger who was Wampanoag. So I recognized the surname. And, here's, writings in the Bible from that family generations and generations and generations ago. So, I think with both of those objects, I'm looking at marginalia with another one that only had, I only had digitized pages because a collector sent it to a researcher who sent it to me. That was a Hawaswi Bible from the island, from Owasso. I think he was probably Bear Clan. And I find it so fascinating. There's genealogy in these Bibles because people are writing down names of their children and they're writing down observations, and they're almost like using the written word the way that we use wampum to record specific events, but in a really minimalistic way. It's really like a memory device because they know what they're talking about and referencing. But I think as a descendant, you just sort of wonder like, oh, I wish I had a little more context there. And, you never know, if you keep your eyes open as a researcher, you may just find a source or speak to the right person and have more of the story. So I think they're really rich documents.
There's also something that I want to just sort of connect between the Wampanoag Bible, because I don't read Wampanoag, right? But knowing that what happens in translation, I guess this also gets into the sort of slyness of language when you were talking, Jeffrey, and I know you were speaking specifically about like queer communities, but the way that language can hold and shift. I mean, even all the Bibles that there are most of them are in translation, which means that they're elevating some things, using metaphors in some ways. Even the same metaphor can mean something different in a different language system or in a different community. And there's something very fascinating to me about that. And even Jeffrey, I'm also thinking about what you were saying, and Elizabeth, what you were saying about this idea of across time, like the same, we know this about like the King James version, like what it might have meant 400 years ago, right? and what it means right now, and even the interpretations of what it means in different communities. So that slippage of language, I think, is so fascinating. And so that's why I was starting to talk about Ngugi wa Thiong'o, this brilliant Kenyan author who wrote Decolonizing the Mind, because it's that same thing, like, how does language hold power, right? And who gets the final say in what the language actually means?
Well, I was just going to ask Elizabeth if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project. That's a topic I connected to via Jessie Littledoe-Baird, who's done a lot of work, I know, in that area. But people aren't aware of it. It would be a great thing for them to learn about. So could you just say a little bit about it?
You know, just as a little bit of context, about 100, 120 years ago, community members in our tribe older community members made a conscious effort to stop handing down an intact language. So people who were really instrumental in our community, like Gladys Wittes, a lot of other folks, would talk about how when they were little, they'd hear their grandparents speaking Wampanoag, and they would ask what they were saying. And they said, no, this isn't for you. You have to live in the world as it is now. You have to speak English. And I think it was a really real strategy to keep their children as safe as they could, because eugenics, of course, had reared its ugly head, and there were terrible things happening. I was reading about Malaga Island in Maine this morning, and that's an example of eugenics, and it's tragic, and you all can look it up today. But that story unfortunately unrolled in a lot of places, and it made life much less safe, ironically, in our homeland than it needed to be. And so the language kind of slept. You know, there are words that are in English that were incorporated from Wampanoag centuries ago. It's just from side-by-side living and working and sharing knowledge and asking for help, probably, and asking for food from tribal members and all that good stuff. But the intact language, you know, it just stopped being something that we had the luxury of being able to share and to have. And so I think gradually tribal members, Helen Manning in my community, who's since passed away, Jessie Littledoe, other tribal members were really, really interested in seeing what could be done in terms of, okay, we have a lot. What does it take to get this started? And there was also a researcher at MIT who was a linguist. And the beauty of our languages in this region, we're all Algonquian linguistic cultural family members. Out to the Great Lakes, out to Wisconsin, Menominee are really, you know, linguistically and culturally related to us, Cree, Powhatan down in Virginia. So we're all related languages, and you can see how we spoke different versions. You know, we had Y, N, R, or L dialects in our languages. And so I'm forgetting, I think Elliot Wallace might have been Nipmuc. So he might have been speaking an L dialect. So you could look at the Bible and you might be able to see if he was transcribing words, he may have used them in his language, whereas in Wampanoag, you'd have a very, very, very similar word because we're really close in Massachusetts, but we wouldn't have the L's. And so there's so much about it. It's really just like really fascinating. There's a Montessori school in Mashpee, and a lot of the kids are soaking up the language because, of course, children learn terribly quickly. But it's wonderful to hear, and I think it's very, you know, hearing our language, hearing other tribal members throughout New England speaking their language. It for me, it's really healing. It really does something for me. It's hard to describe. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear about that, and it's I mean, to Jeffrey, I was just thinking about what you were saying about going to the past or the future, and would you dare want to step into the future because you might be so disappointed? And at least there's one story where it seems like things are going the right direction. So it's great to hear that. We're almost out of time. There were a couple of questions just about curatorial process, and that might actually be a nice way to kind of sneakily get to a conclusion here. So someone asked just why I chose the artists that were in the show. And I certainly think as far as the folks that we've heard from today, it sort of speaks for itself because the relationship that you developed to the project was so rich in every case. And I think did really intersect with a lot of the creative trajectories that you all were on. I will say that I was trying to in choosing the group of 10 along with colleagues at the Fuller and the Box, we were trying to touch on a lot of different kinds of diversity. We think a lot about ethnic diversity now, of course, but we were also thinking about geographic diversity and then the range of materials and processes that were included. So that was why we wanted to include folks like David, who's really identifies as a metalsmith, or Michelle, who really identifies as a potter. So that was another thing that we were thinking about. Very much wanted to make this a project that was led equally by cultural ideas and material realities. And I think that really was borne out in the work. And then there was also a question about whether there was any aspect of the topic or the history of references that we were not able to incorporate into the exhibition that we wanted to, but was not possible. And I guess to that, I just want to say not really, because I keep thinking about your map, Allison. Maybe a map is a better word than a tree, actually. It's like, I think as a curator, the best experiences that you can have is to almost like drop a pebble and see what happens, or a few pebbles, and see how the ripples all sort of overlap in these interpenetrating circles. And I didn't really have any idea what the show would turn into at all, much less probably than any other show I've worked on, because there was no existing artwork. It's a totally new topic for me, a totally new topic for many of the artists involved. Whereas some of the artists have been living with these subjects for their whole lives, and I just think it's really magical what everybody has been able to create together in a real spirit of communal collaboration and sharing and openness and honesty. It's been a really, really terrific experience. So I want to end by thanking you all, not only for the past couple of hours, but the past few years of work on this project. It's been such an honor to have you all involved.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. To reiterate your comments, we all didn't know what this was going to turn out to be either, but took a really leap of blind faith, because we knew this was a story that needed to be told in multiple perspectives. And we were so fortunate that you were on board with this project to lead it. So thank you for everything you've done to make this a reality, and to the artists as well. Allison, Sonia, Christine, Jeffrey, Elizabeth, wonderful to see you again, and the others who were not on the call today. It couldn't have happened without you, and I so respect the amount of thought and time and care that you gave to this project, and how you interpreted what we were really trying to say. It's mind-blowing to me, and I couldn't be prouder of all of you and us as a team working together in collaboration to make this happen. So thank you again. Really, it's wonderful to see it up, and I hope we all get to celebrate in person at some point soon, because I think that would just really be fun. And Ian Hutchinson is on the chat. Ian is part of our partners from the UK, and he's chiming right in. So please be sure. He said, I completely agree with Denise. Thank you all so much. It's been a fantastic discussion. Very much appreciated. It's been a team effort. So thanks again. Bye.